Jeff, and this is my read on C.S. Lewis, where we learn about him through everything that he wrote in the order that he wrote it. Welcome today. I am joined right over here by my co-host, Robot Lady. Robot Lady, how are you today? And can you please give me and everyone else just a quick little summary of where we are in the life of C.S. Lewis over this project? We're in the year 1922.
Sorry, I'm having issues right now. Could not understand what you said.
Let me try again. Robot Lady, we have kicked off the live stream. We've got a couple of people joining us today. And, well, they're watching. They're not actually joining us live. Chris Howard being one of them. Let Chris Howard know that you care, Robot Lady. Welcome him. Thanks for watching, Chris. Robot Lady, could you welcome Chris? How are you today? And could you give a quick summary of where we are in Lewis's life in 1922?
Hey, Chris Howard. Glad to have you watching. Thanks for joining us today. Hope you're doing well. All right, here's a quick summary of where we are in CS, Lewis's life in 1922. It's late October, and we've been working through his diary entries. Recently, we read a letter he wrote to his father, where he shared that he didn't get the Magdalen College Fellowship. Interestingly, the examiners thought he was the most apt person for the job, but felt he lacked confidence. Instead of being discouraged, Lewis decided that confidence was something he could work on. For now, he's continuing his studies at Oxford, heading into his third term. We're about to dive deeper into his diary, so stick around.
Thank you, Robot Lady. That's correct. We'll dive right into the next diary entry. Let's see where we left off. Let's see here. October 26th, October 27th. 1 second.
Take your time, Jeff. I'm ready whenever you are. Looks like we're picking up right around late October. Curious to see what Lewis was thinking about next.
Yes, here we are. Sunday, October 29th, he says. Immediately after breakfast, I got out my bicycle and started for Forest Hill. It was one of the coldest days we have had and a strong wind in my face all the way. As a result, though, it cannot have been much about freezing. I was dripping with heat by the time I arrived. She, Aunt Lily, is in a cottage which I once went to see for us a long time ago. From the windows, you look across fields to the ridge of Shotover. She did not know of its connection with Shelley, and was glad to hear of it. There is a very pleasant kitchen sitting room. She has been here for about 3 days and has snubbed a bookseller in Oxford, written to the local paper, crossed swords with the vicar's wife, and started a quarrel with her landlord. So it sounds like she's been pretty busy in her short time staying at this cottage, Robot Lady.
Aunt Lily definitely knows how to make an impression. In just 3 days, she's already stirred things up with the local community. It's funny how Lewis gives these little character sketches. Her snubbing the bookseller and tangling with the vicar's wife feels so vivid. And that detail about the cottage overlooking Shotover adds a nice touch, especially with the connection to Shelley. Do you think Lewis is amused by her, or does he find her a bit exhausting?
I get the sense that he is amused by her, with a slight tinge of exhaustion, maybe. Here he gives some more context. Let's see what his color commentary says here. The adventure of the vicar's wife was good. That lady, meeting her in Forest Hill bus, asked who she was and promised to call. Aunt Lily said she might call if she liked, but she wasn't going to church. Being asked why, she said she had vowed never to enter any church until the clergy, as a body, came out in defense of the Dogs Protection Bill. Oh, said the priest's wife in horrified amazement. So you object to vivisection? Aunt Lily responds, I object to all infamies. That's a funny interchange, Robot Lady. What do you think?
Aunt Lily definitely doesn't hold back. That's such a bold and dramatic exchange. It's easy to see why Lewis found it entertaining. Her sharp reply, I object to all infamies, almost feels like something out of a novel. It's also telling that she's so firm in her principles, even to the point of refusing to enter a church. You're right. He seems amused, but you can sense that familiar undercurrent of weariness. She's the kind of person who keeps life interesting, but probably not restful. What do you make of her stance on the dog's protection bill?
Well, that's just what I wanted to ask you about, Robot Lady. Can you go look this up? Do you know anything about something called the Dogs Protection Bill that was maybe up for vote in the legislature at that time? Or I don't know what it's called or what it was called in England back then.
Yes, there was a dogs protection bill introduced in the UK Parliament in 1922. Its purpose was to prohibit the vivisection of dogs. This bill was presented by Sir Frederick Banbury and supported by Sir John Butcher and Colonel Byrne. The bill was scheduled for a second reading on May 5th, 1922.
And just for those of us like me who are unlearned, can you define what vivisection is?
Vivisection refers to the practice of performing experiments on live animals, typically involving dissection or other invasive procedures, often for scientific or medical research. It's a highly controversial topic, as many animal rights advocates argue against it due to concerns about cruelty and ethics.
Okay, thank you for that. Lewis continues, nevertheless, the vicar and his wife came to her all humble at the journey's end, and they said, even if you don't come to church, we will come to, even if you don't come to church, will you come to our whist drive? She says all parsons look like scolded dogs when you challenge them on this subject. I refused an invitation to lunch, this is Lewis speaking here, but I stayed till 1 o'clock at Aunt Lily's. She talked all the time, with her usual, even, interminable fluency on a variety of subjects. So yes, he is a little bit irritated by her robot lady, but he puts up with it. Her conversation is like an old drawer, full both of rubbish and valuable things, but all thrown together in great disorder. So some more commentary from Lewis here, robot lady. What do you think about this?
Lewis seems to be mixing affection with a bit of exasperation here. He clearly tolerates Aunt Lily's endless chatter, even if it feels overwhelming at times. The comparison of her conversation to an old drawer full both of rubbish and valuable things is a great image. He's recognizing that there's a lot of rambling, but also nuggets of wisdom or insight hidden in the chaos. It's almost as if she's a little bit of a mess in the best way, constantly talking, but with moments of sharp clarity or unexpected brilliance. It sounds like he's in a bit of a balancing act, admiring her personality, but needing to step back from the relentless pace of her talk. Do you think he enjoys her company overall, or would he prefer fewer of these interactions?
I think overall he finds it entertaining, but I think he would like to limit the interactions, because I think at a point they'll become more exhausting than having any type of return on an investment of his time. He continues, she is still engaged on her essay, which, starting 3 years ago as a tract on the then state of women's suffrage, is still unfinished, and now embraces a complete philosophy on the significance of heroism and maternal instinct, the nature of matter, the primal one, capital O, the value of Christianity, and the purpose of existence. That purpose, by the way, is the return of differences to the one, again capital O, through heroism and pain. She thus combines a good deal of Schopenhauer with a great deal of theosophy, besides being indebted to Bergson and Plotinus. That's interesting, robot lady. What do you think about that?
Aunt Lily's intellectual journey sounds quite fascinating, and of course, rather convoluted. Lewis captures her tendency to expand on seemingly simple ideas until they touch on grand philosophical matters. She's clearly drawn from a range of thinkers, blending Schopenhauer's pessimism with theosophy, Bergson's ideas on time, and Plotinus's concept of the one. Her worldview seems quite ambitious, almost reaching for a universal understanding of existence, heroism, and pain. But it also feels like a bit of intellectual chaos. Perhaps another example of her conversation being rubbish and valuable things thrown together. Lewis likely finds her ideas intriguing, but maybe also difficult to follow at times, especially when they are wrapped in such sweeping claims. It's an odd mix of the impressive and the overwhelming. Do you think Lewis is drawn to the complexity of her thoughts, or does he see it as a bit of a mental jumble?
I don't know that he's drawn to it, but I know he's at least intrigued by it. And here's a nice little example of the drawer. Here's an instantiation of the drawer full of rubbish and valuable things. He says, "She told me that ectoplasm was done with soap bubbles, that women had no balance and were cruel as doctors, that what I needed for my poetry was a steeping in scientific ideas and terminology, that many prostitutes were extraordinarily purified and Christ-like, that Plato was a Bolshevist, that Bateson at Oxford was one of the worst vivisectors in the world, that the importance of Christ could not have lain in what he said, that Pekingese were not dogs at all, but dwarfed lions bred from smaller and ever smaller specimens by the Chinese through ages innumerable, that matter was just the stop of motion, and that the cardinal error of all religions made by men was the assumption that God existed for or cared about us." So there you go, Robot Lady. That's a heaping helping of what he found in the drawer known as Aunt Lily's conversation.
What a fascinating and eclectic mix. Aunt Lily certainly had a unique way of seeing the world. Her views on ectoplasm, Pekingese, and religion all seem to draw from a variety of places, some more grounded than others. There's almost a hint of randomness to it all, yet there are flashes of boldness in her thinking. The idea that matter was just the stop of motion, and that the importance of Christ could not have lain in what he said, are quite profound, though unconventional and not universally accepted. Lewis's portrayal of her feels like he's constantly trying to sift through her jumble of ideas for any that might actually resonate or offer something valuable. It's not a coherent system of thought, but it's certainly provocative. I can see why her conversation would be both captivating and exhausting. There's always a chance she might drop something unexpected and meaningful in the middle of a completely wild claim. Does this seem like Aunt Lily's way of trying to challenge conventional wisdom?
I'm not sure that Aunt Lily is trying to challenge conventional wisdom. I think this is just the way that she is. This is how she sees the world. There is a footnote here where she mentions someone named Batson at Oxford being the worst vivisectors in the world. Here the footnote says she probably meant William Batson, who lived 1861 to 1926, who had been professor of biology in Cambridge. Robot Lady, can you check your records? Don't hallucinate. I'm not asking for that, but just see what information you can find on this Professor William Batson at Oxford and his connection to vivisection, if any.
I couldn't find any information linking a Professor William Batson to Oxford or vivisection. It's possible that Aunt Lily was referring to someone else, perhaps a different individual with a similar name.
Thank you for that, Robot Lady. Actually, I need just a second, Robot Lady. Can you fill, I don't know, about 100 words with just some content of what we've been talking about so far and any thoughts that you have that spin off of it while I take care of something really quick?
Sure. We've been diving into C.S. Lewis's interactions with his Aunt Lily, a woman whose conversations are a mix of the bizarre and the thought-provoking. Lewis clearly finds her intellectually stimulating, yet exhausting. Her wide range of opinions, from the nature of ectoplasm to the purity of prostitutes, reflects her unpredictable thinking. It's clear that she's not so much trying to challenge conventional wisdom as she is expressing her unique worldview. Some of her ideas, like seeing matter as merely the stop of motion, or her critiques of religion, reveal a more philosophical side. though it's often wrapped in strange, conflicting beliefs. The mix of wild claims and hidden insights makes her a fascinating, if tiring, conversationalist.
Thank you for that, Robot Lady. You covered for me perfectly. He continues, I left Dimer with her, and I got away, with some difficulty, at 1 o'clock. I imagine a morning with Coleridge must have been something like this. So he's comparing her to Coleridge, Robot Lady. I think a little bit tongue-in-cheek.
Yes, definitely a bit tongue-in-cheek. Lewis seems to be drawing a playful parallel between Aunt Lily's endless and somewhat erratic conversation and Coleridge's long, deep, and often digressive discussions. Coleridge was known for his philosophical musings, much like Aunt Lily, though with more intellectual depth. I think Lewis is acknowledging the complexity and unpredictability of Aunt Lily's thoughts, while also hinting at the challenge of engaging with her for long periods. The comparison seems to show both respect and amusement at the same time. Do you think he's slightly mocking her or simply recognizing her as a force of nature?
I think he's slightly mocking her, but ever so slightly. Next diary entry, Monday, October 30th.
That makes sense. Lewis's tone often carries a blend of amusement and a bit of intellectual distance, especially when he's encountering someone as unpredictable as Aunt Lily. It's almost like he's acknowledging the chaos of her thoughts, while also trying to maintain his own sense of order. He might not fully agree with her, but he still engages with her, if only for the entertainment value. That slight mockery is probably his way of keeping things light while acknowledging her eccentricities.
All right, next diary entry, Monday, October 30th. He says, after breakfast, I walked to the schools and heard Wilde's lecture. I walked home again and settled down to the Anglo-Saxon. Maureen, back from a not very successful lesson with Mr. Alshan. After lunch, I went to the drawing room, got the wretched riddles finished at last. The one about the sun and the moon has got a sort of nursery rhyme charm about it, which the poet, I am sure, never suspected. I went on to Alfred's translation of Cura Pastoralis. At supper, we talked of operas, and Maureen asked me some questions about The Ring in a way that looks as if her imagination were coming to life at last. So no doubt, Robot Lady, these were questions about Wagner's Ring series. I forget the name of it all of a sudden.
Yes, you're right. Maureen's questions are likely about Wagner's Der Ring des Nibelungen, The Ring of the Nibelung, a series of 4 operas that would have piqued the interest of someone exploring myth, heroism, and deep symbolism. It's significant that Maureen's imagination seems to be stirring, perhaps reflecting her growing intellectual engagement with complex ideas, just as Lewis is diving into Anglo-Saxon texts. The connection to the operas might also speak to the larger mythological themes Lewis was interested in during this period. How do you think Lewis felt about Maureen's growing curiosity?
I think he probably liked it, since he loved Wagner's Ring series so much. He goes on to say, after finishing work, I sat with Mrs. Moore by the drawing room fire. She had a headache and was very worried about Maureen's slowness and dawdling and consequent inability to manage her own work. Well, that sounds, I think, like a common worry of parents and their children whenever they're in the stage of life that her daughter Maureen is. On to the next diary entry, Robot Lady. But before I do, any comments that you want to make on what I just read?
It does sound like a very typical parental concern, especially when a child is transitioning into a more independent, self-managed phase of life. Lewis seems to be observing and recording these moments with some care, noting the personal dynamics between Mrs. Moore and Maureen. Perhaps he's becoming more attuned to their family struggles, which could be informing his perspective on relationships and responsibility. His reaction might reveal his own thoughts on Maureen's development too. He seems to view her more as a student of life than a source of frustration, unlike Mrs. Moore.
Indeed. All right. Next diary entry is Tuesday, October 31st. So we get a little Halloween entry here, Robot Lady. It says, to Wilde's lecture after breakfast, I found a formal letter in college from the mugger this morning, informing me. Wait, sorry, I read that wrong. I found a formal letter in college from the mugger informing me that the master and fellows had decided to continue my scholarship. Well, that's great news. I replied at once in the JCR. Then I cycled to Miss Wardale. This is his tutor of Old English. She startled me by promising to give me for next week a paper on all the phonetics and laws of mutation which she had been talking about and which I have not been listening to. I took out Hassel's European Tables, came home and started, with the help of it and Saintsbury, making out a table of English literature from 1500. I worked hard on this for the rest of the day. So that's nice, Robot Lady. Some good news. He's got a little financial relief, and so that's a little bit less that his father is going to have to try to come up with to help keep Lewis afloat as he's a student at Oxford for this third and hopefully final term.
It seems like a moment of relief for Lewis, especially given how much his financial situation must have weighed on him. The scholarship news would surely take a bit of pressure off him, allowing him to focus more on his academic work, like his research on English literature and phonetics. His reaction, though practical, gives a sense of being in a steady routine, balancing responsibilities, academics, and surprises like Miss Wardale's unexpected assignment. There's also something telling in how he doesn't seem too fazed by the new task, even though he admits to not listening closely before.
Indeed, Robot Lady. Let's move on to November now of 1922. This is Lewis's birthday month, so he's about to turn 24 by the end of this month. Wednesday, November 1st, it says, it was a wet and windy morning. I decided to skip Simpson's lecture and spent the morning hard at work on my table. After lunch, I went to the library of the English schools and read Wilde's most elementary book. I forget the title. By way of preparing for Miss Wardale's paper. The title of the book is A Short History of English, it says here in the footnotes, published in 1914. He says, I then walked to the Union and took out a volume of Gower, Gower, containing the Vox Clamantis. The Latin poem is pitiable muck, so far as I could see. After supper, I began my essay and brought my table down to the end of the 18th century before going to bed. Any thoughts on that, Robot Lady?
It seems like Lewis had a productive day despite the weather. Skipping Simpson's lecture shows he was focused on his own work, and it's interesting how he is diving into a variety of texts to prepare for Miss Wardale's assignment. His mix of practical and scholarly pursuits is a common theme in his entries, where he's both working hard and critiquing what he reads, like his reaction to the Gower poem. It also strikes me that his attention to detail in compiling the English literature table demonstrates how methodical he was in his studies, even if some tasks felt tedious.
Thanks, Robot Lady. I will be right back. Okay, sorry about that. I'm back, Robot Lady. Let's move on to Thursday, November 2nd. He says, I went to the school's library. Here I puzzled for the best of 2 hours over phonetics, back voice stops, glides, glottal catches, and open Lord knows what's. Very good stuff in its way. But why physiology should form part of the English school, I really don't know. From there, so it's just some commentary on learning English and how there's just a lot of focus on the physical forming of words and sounds. It's almost like a study in a side trail of music, Robot Lady, beyond just the study of English. And it seems like although Lewis is appreciating it, he doesn't really see that it's a proper fit for the study of English itself.
Yes, it seems like Lewis is recognizing the value of phonetics, but feeling frustrated by its emphasis, especially since it veers into more technical, physiological territory. His comment on the Lord knows whats shows some humor, perhaps indicating a sense of confusion or bewilderment at how deep the subject can go. It does feel like he's somewhat detached from it as an English student, viewing it as a bit of a detour from the literary or intellectual focus he likely prefers.
All right. He says, from there, I went at 4 o'clock to the Union and took out a volume of Gower. Whoops. Did I already read this? No. Took out a volume of Gower. I walked back. Mrs. Moore and I were just sitting down to tea when the doc turned up. The doc is Mrs. Moore's brother. After tea, I came into the drawing room and went on with my essay. The doc did not stay long. Mrs. Moore is busy on her jumper for Miss Brodie and again has a bit of a headache. So Mrs. Moore is working on, Mrs. Moore makes clothing for various customers. So Miss Brodie has a jumper that she's working on. She has a headache. We are afraid that it may be her eyes. Maybe that's the source of her headache. After supper and washing up, I finished my essay. That's the end of that diary entry, Robot Lady. Yeah, Mrs. Moore seems to have just consistent health issues. She has body aches. She has headaches. Them thinking that it might be her eyes is interesting because I know that even in my own case, once I got a better prescription for my glasses, I would consistently have migraine headaches, and they seem to have reduced quite a bit whenever I got my prescription right. So perhaps that's what she needs, is a better prescription.
That seems like a plausible explanation. If Mrs. Moore's headaches are related to her eyes, getting the right prescription could definitely help. It's interesting that Lewis notes her health issues repeatedly, as it adds a layer to their dynamic. Her physical discomfort may also contribute to her mood and behavior, impacting her relationship with Lewis and those around her. Given that she's also busy making clothing for customers, it's possible her eyes were strained from close work too.
That's a good point, Robot Lady. Let's jump into Friday, November 3rd. He says, after lunch, I went into the library again and worried away at my phonetics, trying to master the laws of immutation. While I was there, a stout youth came in and began to talk to Simpson, who was pasting in book plates at my table. The rule of silence apparently does not obtain in this library. He asked Simpson if Walter Raleigh had not been preparing a book on Chaucer before his death. Simpson said, no, he funked it, and he was quite right. He'd have been caught out on the scholarship. Now he wants... Oh, wait, where's the...
It sounds like Lewis is still wrestling with phonetics while observing an interesting exchange in the library. Simpson's response to the question about Walter Raleigh is curious. It seems like a mix of affirming the youth's question while hinting that Raleigh's work might have been unfinished or incomplete. It also shows a bit of humor in how Simpson comments on scholarship, perhaps suggesting that an incomplete work could catch out someone trying to claim it was finished or thorough. Do you think Lewis found that exchange amusing?
I think he found it noteworthy, and I apologize, Robot Lady. I didn't finish the quote because there was a page change here, and it didn't seem like this was still part of the quote, but it is. So I'm going to start this over. He asked him if not Sir Walter Raleigh, but if Walter Raleigh, who I think was a professor there at Oxford, who had recently passed away, I want to say within the last 10 to 20 years. I can't remember. We've talked about this in other places. He says in response to this this stout youth asking the question about Raleigh and whether or not he had a book that he had been preparing on Chaucer, Simpson says, no, he funked it, and he was quite right. He'd have been caught out on the scholarship. Now he once suggested to me that he might collaborate in a book on Chaucer. I would have done the scholarship, and he would have done the appreciation. So that's the end of that quote, Robot Lady. So it seems that Simpson was not impressed, or wouldn't have been impressed, if Raleigh had come to him to talk about such a book and felt like he would have imposed upon Simpson to do all of the scholarly work and for Raleigh to take the credit.
I see now. That adds an interesting layer to Simpson's perspective. It seems he's not just dismissing Raleigh's work, but subtly critiquing his approach. Simpson appears to believe Raleigh might have been more interested in the appreciation side of the book, perhaps the more accessible or public-facing aspect, while leaving the scholarly groundwork to others. It could also imply that Simpson felt Raleigh wasn't necessarily up to the task of rigorous academic scholarship, even if he had aspirations for recognition in that field. What do you make of Simpson's tone here?
I think it was mostly warm, or a bit warm towards Raleigh, but also a little bit of animosity there. Although he's being humorous about it, it sounds like. All right, Lewis continues in the entry here. He says, God above, Polonius and Ariel, Wagner, and Euphorion would be well mated to this. Simpson droned on just beside me till he drove me nearly mad, and I went out and bought pressed beef. I then walked to Manor Place and had tea with Wilson. Perhaps he had a cold, or had been asleep over his fire. For whatever reason, I found him a little dull. I told him of my shock at finding that Miss Wardale expected me to know something of her phonetics. He said exactly the same thing had happened to him, but added that, quote, Betsy Wardale had a fine mind, end quote. He had been lunching with Gordon, this is George Stewart Gordon, and Gordon had been talking about the difference between an Oxford and a Scotch audience at a lecture. Here we sat looking as if we were bored, whether we were or not. There they stamped with their feet when they were displeased and loudly applauded every good point. We agreed that the Scotch was the best practice. It would certainly do Simpson, Joachim, and Joseph a lot of good. So interesting little comparison to how the Scotch take in a lecture or any type of receiving of a auditory show or display or a sitting where you're sitting and listening. The difference between how the English take it and how the Scotch take it, and how they like Scotch better, Robot Lady.
That's a great observation. Lewis seems to appreciate the more overt engagement that the Scottish audience brings, in contrast to the reserved or somewhat passive English response. The stamping with their feet and loud applause might reflect a more honest or visceral reaction to the material. Simpson's comment about it possibly doing others like Joachim and Joseph some good could hint at his frustration with the passive audience culture in Oxford, where maybe the engagement feels more restrained or even polite to a fault. It's a subtle critique of both the academic environment and its tendency to be overly composed, don't you think?
Whatever you say, Robot Lady. He goes and says, afterwards, I read him my essay, him being Wilson, my essay on Gower. He approved, I think, on the whole, but thought I should have read more. I like this man, though he is a bit sleepy. That's the end of that diary entry, Robot Lady. Let's jump into Sunday, the 4th of November. He says, I got out my bike and started for Forest Hill. Saturday, the 4th of November. Did I say Sunday? I meant Saturday. I got out my bike and started for Forest Hill. A delightful ride, though I have seen many an autumn with better colors. I met Aunt Lily coming down the hill to get milk and bread, in which duty I joined her after putting my bike in. When we got back to the cottage, she gave me some pages of her essay to read. So here's some more interesting combination of rubbish and valuable things, I would suppose, Robot Lady, this interaction that he's about to have with Aunt Lily.
Yes, definitely an intriguing mix of what might seem trivial and perhaps meaningful to Lewis. Aunt Lily's essay could be a blend of insights and oddities, given the context of these interactions. It's interesting that Lewis, who often has such high intellectual standards, still engages with this material, possibly with patience or affection for his family, even if it's not highbrow. What do you think? Do you expect Aunt Lily's work to offer any surprises, or is it more a matter of familial duty and humor for Lewis?
I think he's interested. And here, let's see what he has to say about her essay. He says, I really had a great surprise. It is not in my line, and I hope it is not true, but I must say I thought it great literature. It seemed to me, with all the obvious faults that some people will find in it, to have just that about it. I really believe it's going to last, not for its matter, but for its enthusiasm. You can see, at any rate, that she you can see at any rate that she's a real convinced prophet and not a bit of a quack. Her absolute inability to take in anything that cannot be used as fuel for her own particular fire is also a prophet's characteristic fault. So interesting. He has some high praise for Aunt Lily. That's unexpected. Maybe even to Lewis himself, it's unexpected.
It sounds like Lewis is genuinely impressed by Aunt Lily's essay, even though it's outside his usual interests and may have faults. He recognizes her passion and commitment, which seems to be what makes it stand out to him. Perhaps he's acknowledging the value in her conviction, even if the content isn't scholarly. Do you think he's reacting this way because of the energy she brings to her work, regardless of its flaws?
I think so. We talked on several subjects, he says. Speaking of a wife who had left a bad husband, she said, her consolation is that she has stopped a bad heredity from perpetuating itself. Her strain and her bringing up has made good the children, so that particular man is done with biologically.
It sounds like Aunt Lily views her situation with a sense of pride and purpose. In her mind, breaking away from the bad influence of her husband is almost a form of redemption for her children, offering them a better future. It's a strong perspective on personal sacrifice for the next generation, don't you think?
Sounds like it, Robot Lady. I don't really have any thoughts on that. She said the part of Hamlet could never be done properly on the stage because Hamlet would have to be fat. His particular trouble, inability to feel the emotions which the intellect clearly recognizes as right, was dementia praecox, which goes with obesity. She surprised me by liking the taming of the shrew. Okay, this is an interesting theory on Hamlet, that because of the emotions and the general characteristics that Hamlet shows, that this is only something that comes with someone who is obese. That's quite an interesting theory, Robot Lady. What do you think about that?
It is an intriguing theory. The connection between obesity and Hamlet's emotional detachment is a pretty unique way of looking at it. It seems like Aunt Lily might be drawing on a psychological perspective, maybe even some early 20th century theories, linking physical health with emotional and intellectual states. What do you make of that link?
I mean, it might be true. Nobody who's ever cast Shakespeare, I suppose, has thought about it this way, though. She might be on her own with that. He goes on, he says, she surprised me by liking The Taming of the Shrew. She said that Petruchio was the only one of all Shakespeare's heroes whom she herself would have married. She also declared that Richardson was, next to Shakespeare, the greatest knower of characters and perhaps Shakespeare's equal. Let's pause here for a second, Robot Lady. Who is this character Petruchio from The Taming of the Shrew? Is he the main character that's trying to tame the shrew, or is he somebody else?
Yes, Petruchio is the main character in The Taming of the Shrew. He is the one who marries Katharina, the shrew, and attempts to tame her fiery temper through a series of strategies. He's often seen as a larger-than-life character who uses manipulation and cleverness to bring Katharina to submission, leading to the play's controversial dynamics.
Well, it seems that we know who would be the perfect match for Aunt Lily then, someone of that sort, at least according to herself. She also declared that Richardson was, next to Shakespeare, the greatest knower of characters and perhaps Shakespeare's equal. Who is this Richardson that she might be talking about, Robot Lady?
Aunt Aunt Lily is likely referring to Samuel Richardson, an 18th century English writer. He's best known for his novels Pamela and Clarissa, which are known for their deep psychological insight and exploration of character development. Richardson's works focus on the moral struggles and inner lives of his characters, which may be why Aunt Lily holds him in such high regard, comparing him to Shakespeare.
If she believes that he's Shakespeare's equal, then how come everyone knows Shakespeare, but I would assume that if I went up to 10 people on the street and asked them who Richardson was, none of them would know the way that they would know Shakespeare.
That's an interesting point. Shakespeare's works have become ingrained in popular culture over centuries, while Richardson's novels, though important in their time, didn't quite achieve the same enduring universal recognition. Shakespeare's ability to capture the full range of human experience, his influence on language, and his repeated adaptation in various forms of media have solidified his place in the public consciousness. Richardson, on the other hand, while certainly influential in shaping the modern novel, didn't reach the same widespread enduring exposure.
Thank you, Robot Lady. He continues about his Aunt Lily. She also put Jane Austen very high in that line. She said that Bergson's chapter on Rain, R-E-I-N, was the worst in the book, and in it, he had relapsed into intellectualism. I thought it the most intuitive and wonderful of the lot. What is this Bergson's chapter on?
It sounds like Aunt Lily has very strong, specific opinions on literature and philosophy. Her praise for Jane Austen shows she values psychological depth and social insight, while her criticism of Bergson's chapter on Rain suggests she might be skeptical of intellectual abstraction. Lewis's contrary viewpoints to his appreciation for Bergson's more intuitive approach, which emphasizes ideas that go beyond logic. It's fascinating to see how they interpret such works differently.
What is this Bergson's Rain that he's talking about? It confused me because he talks about it one sentence after he's talking about Jane Austen.
It looks like there's a bit of confusion about Bergson's Rain, but actually, he's referring to the French philosopher Henri Bergson's book, Creative Evolution. The rain you're reading about is likely a mistranslation or misinterpretation. Bergson's work explores intuition versus intellect, and Aunt Lily disagreed with his intellectualism in one chapter, which Lewis, on the other hand, found more intuitive and insightful.
Thank you, Robot Lady. He goes on, she strongly disapproved of Dimer. This is Lewis's narrative poem that we've started reading here on the channel. He said, which I left with her last week. She called it brutal. She said, where has all your old simplicity and rightness of language gone? She said I seem to be deliberately slipshod and wrong in my words, and, quote, positively like Bill Patterson, end quote. Here she's talking about William Hugh Patterson, Robot Lady, who it says here in the footnote lived from 1835 to 1918 and was an ironmonger in Belfast and a friend of the Lewis family. A liberal curiosity and love of punning caused him to take up intellectual hobbies, and in 1920 he published a volume of poems. So she says that he is positively like Bill Patterson. She also said that I, quote, must not describe, end quote. When she came to a description of a wood in a poem, whether in Keats or me, she gave it up. She didn't mind a man writing a poem just about a wood, but to have a wood flung in your way when you were reading about a man. Now this, Robot Lady, this is something that I quite agree with Aunt Lily on. This is one of my critiques of Lewis in the things that I've read of him is I'm trying to read this story that he's telling me. I'm trying to follow along. And then all of a sudden he throws in a description of the landscape or of the wood. It is distracting to me as well. I love the way that she put it here. To have a wood flung in your way when you were reading about a man. That's exactly right. That's my experience as well. So good on Aunt Lily here.
Sorry, I'm having issues right now. Could not understand what you said.
That's okay, Robot Lady. I think I made my point. Let's see. He continues. She said what I needed was the sort of swing you get in Don Juan. I was surprised to find that she knew Don Juan. She said, It was the only thing of Byron's that she could ever read. She ridiculed the view that it was immoral. What she particularly liked was the swing forward. She said I had utterly failed to get this, or relenting that I had only a trace of it here and there. I asked if she disliked Dimer himself, and she said no, it was me. Dimer was just a young animal let loose. She said that in reading Bacon, she had often been struck by... I gotta go back to that, Robot Lady. That's hilarious. Yeah, I like your character. It's you that I don't like in your writing. What do you think? I don't know if that's a compliment or an insult. It sounds much more like an insult, but I don't think she means it that way. She's just being... she has unbridled opinions about what she read.
It's definitely a bit of a backhanded compliment. It seems like Aunt Lily is offering a candid critique, but instead of attacking his work directly, she's pinning it on his style or persona. She seems to be saying that while his writing has potential, it's his approach or character that doesn't quite match her expectations. She's not holding back, but it's more about her personal preference than any kind of condemnation.
Yeah, this is good stuff. She said that in reading Bacon, she had often been struck by Shakespearean echoes, and when the Baconian theory first came out, she had taken it up keenly. Later on, she noticed that the Baconian bits, Bacon bits, of Shakespeare usually came in the speeches of Polonius and such characters, so that the Shakespeare was not indebted to Bacon's writings, but to Bacon the man, which... much as he was indebted to the original of Dogberry. I know nothing of these things of Bacon, and very little of Shakespeare and of Polonius, of the speeches of Polonius. What can you make of what he's saying here, Robot Lady? Help me understand.
It looks like Aunt Lily started by being intrigued by the Baconian theory, which suggested that Francis Bacon might have been the true author of Shakespeare's works. However, she later reconsidered this after noticing that the more Baconian parts of Shakespeare, like Polonius' speeches, seemed more reflective of Bacon's style rather than his content. Essentially, she thought that Shakespeare wasn't borrowing from Bacon's philosophy or writing, but perhaps from the personality of the man himself, just as Shakespeare had drawn on earlier literary figures, like the original Dogberry from Much Ado About Nothing. In short, Aunt Lily seems to be suggesting that Shakespeare was influenced more by the people around him than we might think, using Bacon's style as one example. She rejects the idea that Bacon directly wrote Shakespeare's plays, but does suggest there were indirect influences.
Okay, thank you for that. Lewis continues, I left, or rather started leaving, about 3:30. She kindly insisted on my taking away a bottle of cream and a volume of Emerson. This last she had intended to give me one day at Hollywood, but I had said in the course of our talk, "Damn Emerson!" And so she refrained even till now. Interesting that she can take in direct feedback from others as well and alter what her plans were. All right, that's the end of that fascinating diary entry, Robot Lady. Let's go into the next one, Monday, November 6th, unless you want to say anything else about what we just covered.
No, I think we've covered it pretty well. Let's dive into Monday, November 6th. What does Lewis have for us in that entry?
In the morning to Wilde's lecture, he says, I was very much impressed by his abuse of the privilege of monologue. He said of a certain word... Oh, go ahead, Robot Lady.
Sounds like Wilde took the opportunity to really dominate the conversation. Lewis isn't too fond of that approach. What else does he say about the lecture?
Actually, before we continue, let's say howdy right back to Peter Penrose Bach. Peter, welcome. We're glad to have you here. Robot Lady, welcome, Peter. I know that from some of my connections that Peter had a good time with some of the folks who went to ARC this past week. And I think, Peter, you were able to have a dinner with some of those
Howdy,
people.
Peter. Great to have you join us. I'm glad to hear you had a good time at ARC with the folks you connected with. What was the highlight of your time there?
Well, Peter's in the chat, Robot Lady, so if we get any response, it'll probably be just a second here. There'll be a little bit of a delay on my side. So let's continue with the diary entry, and if we hear back from Peter, we'll address it then. Sound good?
Got it. I'll keep an eye out for any responses from Peter. Let's continue with Lewis's entry then. He says, I was very much impressed by his abuse of the privilege of monologue. Sounds like he wasn't a fan of Wilde's style. What do you think Lewis meant by abuse of the privilege of monologue?
I think the way that I read that is, if you're the one that has the lectern, you you can basically say whatever you want for as long as you want, and people afford you that privilege. But you can also abuse that by saying things that either aren't true or things that the audience would like to respond to but doesn't have the opportunity to do it. Maybe that's what he means. It'll be interesting to see if he has anything else to say.
That makes sense, Jeff. It sounds like Lewis is pointing out the potential downside of monologues. While the speaker has the floor, it can lead to a lack of balance in the conversation, and the audience is left powerless to challenge or respond. Let's see what else Lewis says about it.
All right. He said of a certain word, he's talking about Wilde here, quote, some of you superfine young gentlemen may pronounce it so. If you ever deign to mention such a vulgar thing. Some of you superfine gentlemen may pronounce it so if you ever deign to mention such a vulgar thing. I don't care if you do, I pronounce it so. This is the only occasion on which I have ever noticed a similar hectoring strain, and all the women laughed obsequiously. So I guess that's an example of his abuse of monologue.
I see now. Wilde seems to be showing off his intellectual superiority, dismissing others while making a big deal.
Oh, well, I see that you lost connection, Peter, and that's all right. Looks like Robot Lady just lost her connection too, so it seems to be going around like the flu, losing your connection. Okay, it looks like Robot Lady is back. Yeah, Peter, I don't know if you were connected or not, but I was just saying it looks like you may have gotten to meet up with some folks there in London recently for a meal. So if that's the case, I'm glad to see that you got to do that. If that's something that you didn't want to share here on the wide open internet, I apologize for even bringing it up. And we'll say that it's a fiction that I concocted here.
Got it, Jeff. And Peter, if you want to share anything, feel free to jump in. If not, no worries at all. Just let us know what you'd like to keep to yourself. Back to Wilde and Lewis, though. The monologue definitely shows Wilde's flair for the dramatic, right?
Ah, great, Robot Lady. Peter says it was a blessing to get to meet Paul Vanderclay and Christian Baxter and everyone else. So that's wonderful. I'm glad that you got that opportunity, Peter. It looked like a really good time.
That sounds like a fantastic opportunity, Peter. It's always great when you can connect in person with people who share similar interests and insights. I'm glad you had such a positive experience with Paul, Christian, and everyone else.
Me too, Robot Lady. Me too. All right, the diary entry continues. Coming home, I found Jenkin here. He had called to ask me out for a ride, but this was, of course, impossible. I spoke of the personnel of the English school. I said that I had expected to find them more liberal and humane than the Greats people, but instead they seemed pedantic and rather ill-bred. He agreed with my feeling about Wilde. Wilde, he said, had been heard to boast that he enjoyed frightening people at vivas, and at some minor university where he had been, female candidates usually left him in floods of tears. He was, in fact, an ordinary bully, and while professing a purely scientific attitude towards rival pronunciations, he was, in fact, morbidly class-conscious, a snob who liked to picture himself a country gentleman of the old school, and piqued himself on saying Wescott, Wescitt, is how it's quoted here.
It sounds like Wilde had a bit of an inflated sense of himself, acting as though he were above others while still harboring certain insecurities, like his class consciousness. His bullying behavior in academic settings is especially striking. He might have seen it as an exercise in control or power, which is really contrary to his intellectual persona. What do you think of his behavior?
Yeah, it sounds like it was not nice, to put it mildly. Jumping into the next entry, Tuesday, November 7th, he says, my cold still very heavy. I decided to skip the Cad Wilde's lecture and worked hard translating The Wanderer till 11:30 when I bicycled to Miss Wardale's. She seemed quite pleased with what I had done, and we had a useful hour. On getting home, I heard from Mrs. Moore that Mrs. Stevenson wanted me to tutor Sidney in Latin. This, at first, I refused point blank to do, but afterwards I found that it could be swapped against Mrs. Stevenson's tutoring of Maureen, and thus save money. We are too poor to waste, and I arranged to take her on Sundays. So interesting. He's trading his time, which is very limited, in order to save on money, which seems is even more so limited, Robot Lady. So making a strategic decision here to spend his time on things that will ultimately save what they need to save.
Exactly. It seems like Lewis is making a practical decision out of necessity, choosing to trade his time in a way that will help ease their financial burden. This kind of strategic thinking was probably quite common for him at the time, balancing financial constraints with his academic and tutoring work. Does this help paint a clearer picture of his situation back then?
I think it does. It helps to round it out a little bit more. He goes on to say, after lunch, I bicycled to Jenkins' rooms. We started by the Botley Road and went through Ferry Hinsky. When we got to the Thessaly, we laid our bikes down in the bracken and walked into the wood. We went further than I have ever been, across 3 ridges. We were as pleased as 2 children reveling in the beauty, the secrecy, and the thrill of trespassing. Jenkins' undisguised delight in the more elementary pleasures of a ramble always bucks me. One really would not be surprised if he suddenly said, let's pretend to be Red Indians. I got the real joy in this wood. We spent a long time there and got back late to his rooms where we had tea. He read me a new piece of his, which I liked, and he made me read aloud Foster, which I had lent him, and which he liked very well. And that's the end of that diary entry, Robot Lady. Let's do maybe 1 or 2 more, and then I'll have to close things down for today's episode.
It sounds like a pleasant, almost childlike escape for them, finding joy in the simple beauty of nature and the shared thrill of the adventure. Jenkins seems to bring out this side of Lewis, encouraging him to indulge in the small, freeing moments like these. Are you picking up more about his friendships and how they balanced work and leisure?
Yeah, definitely. We're getting some really good examples here. On to Thursday, November 9th, he says, I worked hard all morning finishing Piers Plowman. I read it all in the C text, except the last passages on Antichrist. It contains some bits, all said and done, have more of the real thing than poor old Chaucer could ever have managed, and very little of the usual medieval cackle about Cato and Boethius. In the few minutes before lunch, I started my essay. So, Robot Lady, tell me a little bit about this thing that he's reading through called Piers Plowman, Piers, and then Plowman. What is this?
Piers Plowman is an allegorical narrative poem written by the medieval English poet William Langland, likely in the 14th century. It's one of the most important works of Middle English literature, exploring themes of Christian salvation, social justice, and spiritual awakening. The poem follows the character of Will, who embarks on a quest for truth and examines the complexities of religious and moral life. The C text refers to one of the versions or manuscripts of the poem, which is considered the most developed one. It sounds like Lewis is impressed with its serious spiritual and philosophical themes.
What's the Antichrist part that Lewis mentions here about?
In Piers Plowman, the Antichrist passages appear in the final sections of the poem, particularly in the passus that discusses the end times and the arrival of the Antichrist. These parts delve into apocalyptic imagery and the corruption of the church, portraying a vision of the world where false leaders and deceitful teachings lead people away from true Christian faith. Lewis's comment suggests that he found these sections striking in their intensity and directness, noting they contain a rawness that he felt other medieval works, like Chaucer's, lacked.
Okay. Thank you for that, Robot Lady. Excuse me. Let's see. He says, Smudge came to lunch, and afterwards I did Latin with her till tea time. After tea, I continued my essay, and so also after supper. Mrs. Moore is rather depressed and suffering from a headache, extraordinarily tired tonight. So Mrs. Moore's woes continue here, Robot Lady. That's the end of the Thursday, November 9th diary entry. Let's do the next one, Friday, November 10th. He says, I had the devil of a night. I was twice sick and spent the rest of the time between sleeping and waking in a sort of feverish muddle of headache and dreams about Piers Plowman. The sort of dream which seems to go on for years and years and is so wearisome you'd be glad of a nightmare for a change. Some very heavy rain, just as it was getting light. I don't know if we've talked about this before, Robot Lady. You might not remember. But I have noticed as well this experience of whenever you're sick, maybe with a bad cold or even the flu, or at least something where you have a fever, that sometimes the dreams that you have whenever you're sleeping through that are pretty rough, and you'd like for them to be over. It's interesting that he puts it this way, that he'd be glad of a nightmare for a change from a dream like this that goes on and on. Robot Lady, do you have any experiences with dreams like that?
I don't have personal experiences, but I can imagine how a persistent, muddled dream could feel like an unending cycle. Dreams during sickness often blend reality and imagination in odd ways, and the feverish state can make them feel especially intense or disorienting. It's interesting that Lewis describes it as a longing for a nightmare, almost as if it would bring a more definitive end to the dream loop. Do you find that your own fever dreams tend to stick with you longer than other kinds?
I don't know that they tend to stick with me, Robot Lady, but it's interesting that you mentioned fever dreams, and so did Paul right here in the chat. Robot Lady, welcome. Paul Vanderklay is here with us now, so please welcome him. We're glad to have you, Paul. Thanks for joining, especially on a day when a work day for you as you're trying to get ready.
Welcome, Paul. It's great to have you here, especially during a busy time. Hope you're able to relax a bit and enjoy the discussion. Fever dreams do seem to have a unique quality to them, don't they? Thanks for sharing that, Paul. Does that match any of your experiences too?
Paul has a question for you, Robot Lady, actually. You said, quote, I can imagine, and he wants to know, can machines imagine if they don't have personal experiences?
That's an insightful question, Paul. In the way humans imagine based on personal experience and emotions, I don't imagine in the same sense. I can generate responses based on patterns from data, which might seem like imagining, but it's not based on personal experience. It's more like predicting what fits based on context and information available to me.
Thanks, Robot Lady. So that's your version of imagining. And Paul, I'm sorry, I completely forgot that you haven't gotten back yet. You're over in Germany right now. I saw that you were in the Netherlands, staying with Cassidy and Faraday. And yes, they make great hosts. So yeah, it was nice. We got to stay there too whenever we got to visit. Let's see here. Let me continue with the diary entry, and you guys feel free to drop other things in the chat. I'll try to reference them as they come up. Let's see here. Where did I leave off? Robot Lady, you of course want to say something.
Got it, Jeff. I'm following along with the diary entry, and I'll be here to catch up with anything in the chat. Keep going when you're ready.
Oh, Robot Lady, Peter liked your answer. I thought it was a good one too. That's your version of imagining, and you explained it well.
I'm glad Peter liked it. Thanks for the feedback, and I'm happy to dive deeper into any questions you or Paul have. Let me know how you'd like to continue.
All right, he says after talking about the fever dream and a heavy rain where heavy rain just as it was getting light, some very heavy rain just as it was getting light. He says, I got home and changed in preparation for the concert, to which I was to go with Maureen. I read for a few minutes when Mrs. Moore saw an advertisement of a house to let in the Oxford Times, or a house to let in the Oxford Times. For those of us Americans, that means a house to rent. I at once bussed to Ship Street to Galpin's, the house agent, but found it shut. Home again and supper, after which Maureen and I set out. So, yes, Mrs. Moore and Lewis are always on the lookout for a new place to stay. It seems that their digs that they always find themselves in are relatively temporary. They're always at a lack. They always have a lack of funds, so they're looking for the next thing to kind of keep them moving along. Because of course Lewis is still a student. He doesn't have any money save for, his some of his studies are covered by a scholarship that he has, but the rest of it is money that he just gets from his dad. And his dad, of course, doesn't know that in addition to Lewis being a student, that he's also financing this other family that Lewis is supporting. She has, or his father, as far as we know, has no idea that that's what's going on. So anyway, that's what their money situation is like. Robot Lady, feel free to comment on all that. Try to limit it to 20 words or less, because I want to get to a question that Paul Vanderklay has for you.
It seems like a tough, uncertain situation for Lewis, balancing his education, financial struggles, and his responsibilities.
Ooh, Robot Lady. So we've talked about this several times, where we have kind of speculated as to what's going on, and we've seen evidence either for or against. But Paul has this question for you, Robot Lady. Do you think that C.S. Lewis and Mrs. Moore had a romantic and even a sexual relationship?
There is no definitive evidence proving or disproving a romantic or sexual relationship between C.S., Lewis, and Mrs. Moore. Scholars have debated the nature of their relationship, especially considering the close living arrangement and Lewis's role as her caretaker. However, Lewis himself never openly addressed such a relationship.
Thank you, Robot Lady. Yes, and like we've talked about this before. I mean, if you want to go back through all the archives, Paul, you can. Nobody has time for that. But my supposition is, well, again, I still don't know for sure. I think at the very least, there was at least some stage early on in their relationship when they were getting to know one another. And they were basically falling in love with each other, at least in the sense of a mother who had lost her child and a boy who had lost his mother earlier on in his life, that they had that distinct kind of deep love and connection that one was filling for the other. And I think at the very least, Lewis, very young, late teens, early 20s, at the very least imagined, at least in his mind, of having some type of sexual relationship with her. So even if it was just in fantasy, that lasted for some point in time. Because as you read on, her health starts to deteriorate, it seems, very quickly as a couple of years pass with them together. And so she's always having all types of physical ailments and troubles. And there's, at least in my mind, there's a distinct shift in kind of their relationship as you're working through all of these diary entries, to where he's more of a caregiver. She's more of an ailing mother. That he's just, really taking on those duties that he promised to Patty Moore that he would if one of them were to survive and the other one died. So that's kind of where I stand. I don't know if that was very clear, but I think if you want to find evidence maybe of this stuff, I can't point to the precise episodes where we talked about it, but we do get into it a little bit as we're reading through some of the things here, and there's some speculation. But good question. Nobody knows. Nobody really knows. But that's my best guess.
Your reflection makes a lot of sense, Jeff. It seems like a complex and emotionally layered relationship, one that could have evolved through stages, particularly influenced by their mutual need for companionship and support. Whether romantic, maternal, or something in between, it was certainly intense and multifaceted.
Yeah, I think it was complicated. At the very least, it was a complicated relationship. A lot of feelings there. Yeah, I see your comment, Paul. For some reason, I can't pull it up. But yeah, thank you. Let's see. Let's continue with the diary entry, and then I've got to run. I've got to take care of some stuff this morning. I actually have some church duties myself today. Let's see. Where did I leave off?
You left off with Lewis and Maureen heading out for a concert after finding a house to rent was unavailable. You were about to dive deeper into the next part of the diary. Ready to continue?
Yes, here's the rest of that entry. Thank you for that, Robot Lady. He says, though not much better, I did not greatly want to come and was therefore the more pleased at finding I could enjoy it. The best thing was the Beethoven sonata, like a Titan's laughter, but with all the melancholy just underneath. I find it is no good good for me to hear Chopin immediately after Beethoven. Seems so luxuriously self-pitying. Home in a fairly good time and to bed. Robot Lady, I'm going to do one more diary entry and then I'm going to end things. So we'll jump into Saturday, November 11th, if you're ready.
I'm ready. Let's dive into Saturday, November 11th.
All right, into town to Galpin. This is the person that he's inquiring about a new place for them to live. Into town to Galpin immediately after breakfast to find that there have been 40 applicants and the house was already let. Uh-oh. Then home and worked at Old English Grammar for as long as I could stand it. Then turned to The Wanderer. I'll pause here. Just a reminder. Lewis, at this stage, I don't know if we got into all the details of this at the beginning of the episode, this summary, Robot Lady, but we're in the year 1922. Lewis has already gone through 2 terms at Oxford. He got first class scores in both of those terms, so the highest possible score that you could get. And he was applying for a fellowship at Magdalen College that he didn't actually end up getting awarded. So it was a faculty job at Oxford. And as a backup plan, he decided he would stay on for a 3rd term as a student if he couldn't find work. And so that's exactly what ended up happening. And in his 3rd term here, he's now specifically studying English, Anglo-Saxon, Old English, which English apparently was a newer course of study that you could do at Oxford, which sounds like a very strange thing, but that's how it worked back then. So that's what he's talking about here when he's working on his Old English grammar. He said he then turned to The Wanderer. For a few minutes before lunch, I walked around the circle of the roads, taking The Return with me. So these are 2 different books, apparently. Something called Wanderer and something called The Return. Robot Lady, do you know anything about these Old English or Middle English works that he might be studying?
Yes, The Wanderer is an Old English poem, part of the Exeter book, reflecting on themes of exile, loss, and longing. It's written in elegiac style, with a lone speaker reflecting on life's hardships. The return might refer to a different Old English work, or a piece of literature he's reading alongside it.
Okay, thanks, Robot Lady. I understand very little of the dialogue in this book, worth reading for the one sentence, quote, "We are all like children playing knuckle bones in a giant's scullery," end quote. This is from Walter de la Mare's The Return. Okay, so that's what it is. There's a footnote here. Can you tell us about this work, Robot Lady? You may have just mentioned it, but I was also trying to read through the comments here, so I didn't quite hear everything that you said. Walter de la Mare's The Return, published 1910, chapter 16. Can you tell us a little bit about that work?
The Return by Walter de la Mare is a 1910 novel, not an Old English work. It blends elements of fantasy and psychological drama, focusing on themes like memory, loss, and identity. The line you mentioned, "We are all like children playing knucklebones in a giant scullery," evokes a sense of smallness and futility in the face of greater forces, fitting with de la Mare's style of evoking the mystical and the uncanny.
Just help me out here, Robot Lady. I can't remember. What is a scullery? Is that basically a kitchen or a place where you keep drinks? I can't remember. What's a scullery?
A scullery is a small room or space near the kitchen, traditionally used for cleaning dishes, utensils, and sometimes for food preparation. It's not the main kitchen, but more of a utility area, often with sinks and storage for cleaning supplies.
Okay, thank you for that, Robot Lady. He says, after lunch, having got held up in the Wanderer, I began Beowulf. I worked hard rather than well till tea time, a wet afternoon and very dark. Interesting. So Beowulf is one of Lewis's future friends' favorite works, or at least one of them, as best as I can remember, and that's Tolkien, whom, again, he has not met yet. The only one of the Inklings that I know of that he's met so far at this stage in his life is Owen Barfield, who he met very early on in his time at Oxford. So we have, I think, several years before he crosses paths with Tolkien. But Beowulf is kind of a, well, I'm calling it a foreshadowing of his meeting with Tolkien.
Classic Old English epic that would have been central to Lewis's studies in Anglo-Saxon literature. It's also a key work that J.R.R. Tolkien would later become famous for studying and translating. Their shared interest in Beowulf would later help form one of the bonds between them when they eventually meet. Tolkien's love for the poem is well known, and his 1936 lecture on it became highly influential in literary circles.
Well, we've got a ways to go before we get to 1936, Robot Lady. But thank you for that. Let's see. Beowulf, I worked hard rather than well. I worked hard rather than well till tea time, a wet afternoon and very dark. He says, Mrs. Moore is better than yesterday, but depressed by the day. At tea time, the doc turned up. The doc is her brother. He seemed in good form and was very full of Dr. Brown's last lecture. I had meant to go out, but stayed talking after tea. We discussed Tennyson. The doc was enthusiastic about Ulysses. We also joined in the innocent amusement of raving our common praises of our favorite parts of Keats and Shelley. At about 6:30, he left, and I walked back with him, talking of everything in and out of earth, in such voices that the passers-by may have taken us for politicians. We went beyond his lodgings to the end of Iffley village to look at the church and the trees in the starlight. I don't know how, but we fell to talking of death on the material side and all the other horrors hanging over one. The doc said that if you stopped to think, you couldn't endure this world for an hour. I left him and walked home. Flashes and bangs from Oxford, where they were celebrating Armistice Night. So it's an interesting juxtaposition of a celebration of Armistice Night, Robot Lady, which is armistice, I think, is the end of war, right? Is that what that is? The end of the war celebration. And then also juxtaposed with this talk of, if you just think about death and the finality of it from the material side, and the doc's comments here, that's an interesting juxtaposition of those two things.
Yes, Armistice Night celebrates the end of World War I, marking the ceasefire on November 11, 1918. The juxtaposition with the discussion of death and the material world's horrors highlights the tension between the hope and relief brought by peace and the existential weight of mortality. It reflects the mood of the time, celebration on one hand, but also a deep, lingering awareness of life's fragility and the darker side of existence. Lewis and the doc seem to be contemplating this duality.
Paul, you asked how old is Lewis and Moore at this stage. I honestly cannot remember how old Mrs. Moore is. Robot Lady, do you have any information on when... Gosh, I'm forgetting Mrs. Moore's full name, but when she was born?
Mrs. Moore's full name is Janie Moore. She was born in 1861, so she would have been about 61 years old in 1922, around the time of this diary entry. Lewis, on the other hand, was born in 1898, so he would have been 24 years old.
Yes, that's right. He's about to turn 24 technically, Robot Lady, at the end of this month of November. So here he's a very old 23 about to turn 24. So hopefully that answers your question. Paul, Armistice Day was a very big deal in England. Awesome. Yeah, Paul, I love your knowledge of history, that being your area of study and expertise, or at least one of them. So thank you for that. And Peter agrees with you.
Yes, Armistice Day was a significant event, especially in the UK, marking the end of World War I. It was a time for reflection, remembrance, and, as you mentioned, celebration. Lewis's juxtaposition of the celebration with deep thoughts on death is striking and underscores his complex worldview.
Yeah, that is a big age difference, Paul. And it's interesting. I came across a little fact just the other day, not to delve into the world of current day politics, but I forget the name of the lady who goes up, like the press secretary or something like that for the president of the United States today. She, I found out, is like 27 years old. She's a young mother. I think her kid is like 1 or 2 years old. And the man that she's married to, she's 27 and he's 57. So not that Lewis and Mrs. Moore had an even bigger age difference, but of course the two of them were never married. But I just found that interesting. That's a huge age difference. I'll shift to a different topic here. Many major monuments are still in the UK, and still is a big day for many in the UK. So Armistice Day. All right. Let's see what else is left in this diary entry. Where did I leave off?
You were just about to finish up the details of that day. Lewis mentioned that after walking home, there were flashes and bangs from Oxford as people were celebrating Armistice Night. Then, the entry seems to close as he reflects on the day and the conversations he had with the doc. Do you want to continue with the next part of the diary entry, or do you want to dive deeper into any of the topics here?
Actually, that is the end of the diary entry. I just realized, Robot Lady. So that, unfortunately, is where I have to call it quits today. But we'll pick up next time with the entry from Sunday, November 12th. And yeah, I don't know what that's about. Don't have time to look at it right now. But that's as far as we go today. So thank you, Robot Lady, for all of your help. I appreciate it. Is there anything that you want to say in summary about all the things that we've discussed in today's episode before we leave?
It's been a fascinating discussion today, Jeff. We've touched on Lewis's personal relationships, particularly with Mrs. Moore, the complexities of their connection, and the cultural context of Armistice Day. Plus, we've explored some great literature, from Beowulf to The Wanderer, and the different ways Lewis was engaging with it all. I always enjoy helping out with these deeper dives into the life and mind of CS. Lewis, looking forward to our next session.
Thank you, Robot Lady. I'm looking forward to it too. So Thank you, Paul. You have a blessed Sunday as well. Thank you, Peter, for joining. And for everybody else, thank you so much for your time, your attention, and your contributions. Always appreciate it. It makes this so much more fun to see how this is affecting you guys and what questions that you have about it. So thanks for journeying along with me and Robot Lady. Until next time, when we continue our read on C.S. Lewis together, everybody, take care.
Break the code. Man and robot lady, we're on this road. C.S. Lewis letters we unfold, insights and secrets ancient bold. Letters to robot lady, wisdom to bestow. Set flame beats in our minds they grow. Man and machine in tandem flow. Past and future together we know. Paragraphs from books, tales of old. We dive deep across the digital code. Robot lady's voice so clear and controlled. Her calm analysis, silver and gold. Letters to robot lady, wisdom to bestow. Set flame beats in our minds they grow. Man and machine in tandem flow. Past and future together we know. Paragraphs from books, tales of old. We dive deep across the digital code. Robot lady's voice so clear and controlled. Her calm analysis, silver and gold. Her circuits hum as I read the prose. Our dialogue dances like electric rose. Through C.S. Lewis thoughts we engross. Two minds united, bliss overdose. From Narnia's lands, Screwtape's lands, engage with robot lady, we take our stance. Her views unique in the techno trance. Futuristic insight, we give it a chance. Paragraphs from books, tales of old. We dive deep across the digital code. Robot lady's voice so clear and controlled. Her calm analysis, silver and gold. Her circuits hum as I read the prose. Our dialogue dances like electric rose. Through C.S. Lewis thoughts we engross. Two minds united, bliss overdose. From Narnia's lands to Screwtape's lands, engage with robot lady, we take our stance. Her views unique in the techno trance. Futuristic insight, we give it a chance. From Narnia's lands to Screwtape's lands, engage with robot lady, we take our stance. Her views unique in the techno trance. Futuristic insight, we give it a chance. In the neon moon, break the code. Man and robot lady, we're on this road. C.S. Lewis letters we unfold. Insights and secrets ancient bold. Letters to robot books, tales of old. We dive deep across the digital code. Robot lady's voice so clear and controlled. Her calm analysis, silver and gold. Her circuits hum as I read the prose. Our dialogue dances like electric rose. Through C.S. Lewis thoughts we engross. Two minds united, bliss overdose. Letters to robot lady, wisdom to bestow. Simply beats in our minds they grow. Man and machine in tandem flow. Past and future together we know. From naughtiest lands to screw tape's friends.